Better pre-flop decisions make you a more profitable player. Tonight, we'll immerse ourselves in the foundational elements that shape every hand you play, starting with the choices you make before the community cards are ever dealt. You'll discover why understanding your starting hands, evaluating your position at the table, and recognizing the tendencies of those around you form the bedrock of winning play. As we continue, you will be gently introduced to the principles that guide whether you should call, raise, or fold, and how these decisions connect to deeper concepts like hand ranges, pot odds, and table dynamics. The goal is to help you see each pre-flop situation not as a standalone event, but as a vital piece of your long-term strategy for profit. This journey is designed for calm, easy listening. You'll notice the pace is steady, and the content unfolds in a way that encourages both relaxation and understanding. There will be no sudden shifts in tone or tempo, allowing you to settle in and absorb the material at your own comfort. By the end, you'll be equipped with practical insights for making more disciplined and effective pre-flop decisions, giving you a clearer path to stronger results at the table. Let the rhythm of the guidance ease you into a restful state, as you internalize the habits that lead to long-term success in cash game poker. Chapter 1. Understanding starting hands. Most of the money you lose at poker is decided before the flop. Not on the river. Not on the turn. Before the hand even starts. Every hand begins with 2 cards. Those 2 cards tell you a lot. Some hands have built-in power. They can win pots on their own. Others need a lot to go right. And many are simply not worth playing. That first decision is where most mistakes are made. If you look at the game mathematically, you'll see there are 1,326 possible starting hand combinations. But if you ignore suits and just focus on unique values and suitedness, that number shrinks to 169 distinct categories. 13 of those are pocket pairs, 78 are suited combinations, and 78 are offsuit combinations. Every single hand you play falls into one of those groups, and where it lands shapes everything you do before the flop. The language players use to talk about these hands usually falls into 3 main categories: premium, speculative, and marginal. Each category comes with its own set of expectations and risks. Premium hands are the ones that get your heart rate up. Pocket aces, kings, queens, jacks, and ace-king are the hands most players agree sit at the top of the range. Together they account for roughly 2 to 3% of all starting hand combinations, which means you might play dozens of hands before seeing one, which means you might play 50 or even 100 hands and see only a couple of them. That rarity is what makes them so valuable and why they are almost always played aggressively. Speculative hands are a different story. These are hands like small pocket pairs or suited connectors. Think 5-6 suited or pocket threes. They do not have much raw power on their own, but they can turn into monsters if the board cooperates. They do not win frequently, but when they do connect with the board, the payout can be substantial. The trick is that you need the right conditions to make them worth playing. If the stacks are deep and there are several players in the pot, speculative hands become much more attractive. If you are short-stacked or facing a big raise, they lose a lot of their appeal. Marginal hands sit in that uncomfortable space between the two. These are hands that do not really fit into either category. They might look appealing at first glance, something like King 10 offsuit or Queen 9, but they are often dominated by stronger holdings and do not play well against aggression. Played too often, or in the wrong situations, these hands can quietly drain your stack without you realizing why. For most players, the safest approach is to let them go, unless there is a very compelling reason to get involved. Being able to sort your starting hands into these categories before you act is one of the most important skills you can develop. It gives you a simple mental framework for making decisions before any other variable comes into play. You do not have to guess or hope. You can look at your cards, think about which group they belong to, and make a plan from there. Now, if you are trying to make money in cash games, this habit becomes even more critical. Every single chip you put into the pot is real money, and every mistake chips away at your results over time. The hands you choose to play are entirely up to you. Nobody can force you to call or raise before the flop. That means hand selection is one of the most controllable parts of your game. If you play too many hands, especially weak ones, you are likely setting yourself up for tough decisions and potentially significant losses over time. If you play too few, you risk missing value and allowing more aggressive players to exploit your passivity. Striking the right balance is one of the key factors that tends to separate profitable players from the rest. Let us put some numbers to it. The odds of being dealt pocket aces are about 220 to 1, meaning you can expect to see them roughly once every 221 hands. That means you will only see aces once every couple of hundred hands. Any pocket pair comes around roughly once every 17 hands, or about 6% of the time. Most of what you are dealt will not be a pair at all. That is why sound hand selection matters so much. You cannot wait around for the absolute best hands, but you also cannot justify playing every single hand you see. Over thousands of hands, the little decisions add up. Playing premium hands aggressively leads to more wins and fewer tough spots. Playing speculative hands wisely can add some big pots to your stack without exposing you to too much risk. Folding marginal hands keeps you out of trouble and helps preserve your bankroll. This discipline, repeated hand after hand, is widely considered one of the key traits that separates winning players from those who break even or lose over time. When you look at your cards before the flop, recognizing their strength quickly can make your next move much easier. If you are holding pocket aces, kings, queens, or ace-king, the best play is often to raise. These hands do well against almost anything your opponents could have. Raising builds the pot when you are most likely to be ahead and puts pressure on weaker hands to fold. You do not want to let too many players in cheaply when you are holding the best cards. With speculative hands, you have to be more careful. The value comes from making strong hands when the board cooperates, not from the raw strength of your starting cards. You might call a small raise if you and your opponent both have plenty of chips behind, hoping to hit a set or a straight. If the stacks are shallow or the raise is large, it is usually better to just fold and wait for a better spot. These hands are all about conditions. They do not shine on their own. Marginal hands require the most discipline. They might win occasionally, but they lose far more often, particularly against premium holdings. The temptation to play them grows stronger after a long stretch of folding, but the long-term math is not in your favor. In most situations, and especially when facing a raise from an early position player, folding is the right call. As you get more comfortable recognizing the category your hand falls into, your pre-flop decisions will start to feel more natural. You will not have to second-guess yourself or wonder if you made the right move. Instead, you will develop a habit of acting based on the type of hand you are dealt and the situation at the table. This habit is what builds confidence and consistency, two qualities that are essential for long-term success in cash games. There is also a practical benefit to this approach. By filtering out weak hands before the flop, you cut down on the number of difficult spots you will face later in the hand. You will find yourself playing with stronger ranges, which means you will have better equity when the money goes in. This does not just make the game easier to navigate. It also reduces the swings in your bankroll, making it easier to manage your results over time. If you are just starting out, a simple rule to keep in mind is to focus on premium and strong hands. This will help you avoid many of the traps that catch new players off guard. As you gain experience, you can start to experiment with a wider range of hands, but only when the conditions are right. The foundation should always be a disciplined, thoughtful approach to hand selection. Every hand you fold before the flop is a hand you do not have to play out of position or against a stronger range. Every hand you raise with confidence is a chance to build a pot when you are most likely ahead. The discipline you build now will pay off every time you sit down to play. Over time, you will start to see the patterns. The game will slow down. You will find yourself making better decisions, one hand at a time. Let yourself settle into that rhythm. Take a breath before you act. Trust your categories and your process. The cards will keep coming, and with each new hand, you will have another chance to make the right choice. The more you practice, the more natural it will feel. The game will become less about guessing and more about knowing where you stand before the first bet is even made. Chapter 2: The Role of Position. Most players who have just started thinking about starting hand selection quickly run into a problem. The same hand can feel completely different depending on where you are sitting. Good cards matter, but where you sit changes their value entirely. Where you sit around the table, and when you have to act in each betting round, can change the whole meaning of your hand. Your seat is not just a number. It is a lens through which you should view every decision, even before the cards are dealt. The table is divided into distinct zones, and each one carries a different set of risks and opportunities. Picture a 9-handed game. The first few seats to act are called early position. These are the players who have to make decisions with almost no information about how the rest of the table will play their hands. If you are in one of these seats, you do not know whether the players behind you will fold, call, or raise. That means there is a lot of uncertainty. The only way to protect yourself from that uncertainty is to play strong hands. You will want to be disciplined and avoid getting involved with hands that might look decent but are not strong enough to withstand a raise or a re-raise from someone yet to act. If you open the betting from early position with a hand that is not strong enough, you will often end up in tough spots. As you move a little farther from the blinds, you reach what is called middle position. Now you have seen how the earliest seats have acted, so you have a bit more information. You are still not in the clear though, because there are still several players left to act behind you, including the most dangerous seats at the table. From here, you can start to add a few more hands to your opening range, but you still need to be careful. It is not quite time to get loose, but you are not as restricted as those early seats. Then we come to the late positions. These are the cutoff and the button, which are the two seats closest to the dealer button. If you are on the button, you act last post-flop on every street after the flop. Pre-flop, the blinds act after you, but once the flop is dealt, you act last for the rest of the hand, giving you a sustained informational advantage across all remaining streets. You have the most information of anyone who is not in the blinds. This is a huge advantage, and it changes the way you should think about your starting hands. The cutoff and button are the seats where you can open with a much wider range of hands, including some that you would never consider playing from early position. You can do this because you know how many players are still involved, and you have a good sense of what kind of hands they might have based on their actions. The reason these differences matter so much is because of the order of action. In poker, information is power. Early position players are working in the dark, while late position players get to see how everyone else reacts before they have to make a decision. That means the risks and rewards of playing a hand change depending on where you sit. If you are early, you have to be selective and patient. If you are late, you can be more creative and take advantage of what you see happening at the table. When you are on the button, you get to act last on every betting round after the flop. The blinds, despite acting last pre-flop, are forced to act first post-flop, making the button the most advantageous seat at the table. This is not just a small benefit. It is one of the most powerful tools you have in no-limit Texas Hold'em. You can see if the players before you are showing strength or weakness. If everyone checks to you, that often signals weakness, and you may be able to take the pot away with a well-timed bet, even if your cards are not especially strong. This is not a guarantee, but position gives you the opportunity to find out cheaply. If someone makes a big bet, you have the option to fold without risking more chips, or to call or raise if you have a strong hand. This advantage is not just about bluffing or taking pots away from cautious players. It is also about making better decisions with strong hands. When you have more information, you can make more accurate reads on your opponents. You get to control the size of the pot. If you have a marginal hand, you can keep the pot small by checking or calling. If you have a big hand, you can build the pot by betting or raising. Acting last lets you tailor your strategy to the situation in front of you, rather than guessing what the rest of the table might do. Another benefit is that you can open up your starting hand selection from late position. In these seats, hands like suited connectors or small pairs go up in value, because you have the chance to see what everyone else does before you act. You are not risking as much by entering the pot, and you will have position on most opponents after the flop. This means you will be able to realize the full potential of your hand more often, maximizing your expected value. Over thousands of hands, this edge adds up to a significant difference in your results. You might be wondering how much to widen your range when you are in these seats. There is no fixed answer, because it depends on the table. Some tables are full of aggressive players who like to 3-bet from the blinds, making it risky to open too wide. Other tables have passive players who rarely fight back, giving you more freedom to play a larger variety of hands. The key is to remain flexible and pay attention to who is behind you. If you notice the players in the blinds are tight and rarely defend, you can get away with opening even more hands from the cutoff or button. If they are aggressive, you might want to pull back a little and avoid getting caught in tough spots. From early position, the story is different. Because you are acting with so little information, you need to protect yourself by playing only your strongest hands. This is called tightening your range, and it is not about being timid. It is about compensating for the structural disadvantage of having to act before everyone else. The same hand that might be a routine open from the button could be a fold from under the gun. You are playing the same game, but the rules change based on your seat. As you move closer to the button, you can gradually widen your starting hand selection. This does not mean you should start playing every hand, but it does mean that hands you would fold in early position become profitable, opens in late position. This approach is called dynamic range adjustment. It means you are always thinking about where you are at the table and how that changes the value of your cards. While some players do use range charts as a starting reference, the goal over time is to internalize these principles and make decisions based on the flow of the game and the players around you. Aggression is another area where position matters. From early position, you want to be more conservative, because you are more likely to face resistance from players who act after you. From late position, you can be more aggressive, using your informational advantage to put pressure on your opponents. This is not just about betting more often. It is about choosing your spots carefully, knowing that your position gives you leverage that others do not have. One of the best ways to improve your results in cash games is to master the art of playing in position. Every chip you save by folding weak hands in early position, and every chip you win by exploiting weakness in late position, adds up over time. Your seat is not just a place to sit. It is your most consistent tool for finding profitable spots and avoiding costly mistakes. Take a moment to picture yourself at the table. The dealer button is a few seats to your right. You are not just waiting for good cards. You are watching the action, thinking about who is left to act, and adjusting your plan as the hand develops. The game slows down for you. You are not rushing. You are letting the table come to you, using your position to make every decision a little bit easier, a little bit more profitable. That is the rhythm of a thoughtful poker player. It is quiet, steady, and always aware of where you sit. Chapter 3: Range Construction Basics. Let's take a moment to settle in and focus on a subtle but powerful shift in how we think about poker hands before the flop. If you've been working on your positional awareness, you already know why acting earlier makes things tougher, and why the button feels like a gift. Now let's add another layer. Instead of trying to guess the one exact hand an opponent might have, or thinking about your own hand in isolation, let's start building out the idea of a hand range. This is how profitable players see the game. They do not ask, "Does my opponent have ace-king?" They ask, "How many combinations of strong hands, medium hands, and speculative hands could this player reasonably have right now, given everything I know?" A hand range, simply put, is the complete list of hands a player might be holding in a specific situation. In Texas Hold'em, you're looking at 1,326 possible two-card starting combinations. Every pocket pair has 6 possible combinations, since there are 4 cards of each rank, and you choose 2. Each suited non-pair has 4 combinations, 1 for each suit, and every offsuit non-pair has 12 combinations, covering all the ways 2 different ranks can appear in different suits. That's a massive field to narrow down, so we use position and betting action to trim it into something manageable. Early position is where you need to be most careful. When you're first to act, you do not know what the rest of the table will do after you. So the range you choose to play should be tight and value heavy. We're talking about the top 8% or so of hands, as a general guide. That means you're mostly sticking to strong pairs, premium Broadway hands, and maybe a suited connector or 2 if the table is soft. The reason you want to be so selective is simple. You'll be out of position for the rest of the hand, and you'll be facing more players with unknown holdings. The fewer weak hands you play here, the less trouble you'll find yourself in post-flop. As you move into middle position, things start to open up. Players in these seats have fewer opponents left to act, so the likelihood of facing a strong hand behind them drops a bit. Here you can start including more speculative hands. Think suited connectors, suited aces, and some lower pairs that you might fold in early position. Your range can stretch to around 15 or 20% of all possible starting hands. You're still not going wild, but you have more room to maneuver and can take advantage of the fact that being closer to the button gives you more information. Late position, especially the cutoff and the button, is where your range gets widest. Now you're armed with the knowledge of how most of the table has acted, and you'll have the best seat for the rest of the hand if you play. On the button, solver-derived strategies often support opening ranges of 40 to 50% of hands in certain game conditions, though the right number depends heavily on the tendencies of the players in the blinds and the overall table dynamic. That means you'll include a lot of suited hands, one-gappers, and even some weaker offsuit broadways or suited kings and queens. This is not just about playing more hands because it's fun. It's because you have the advantage of acting last on every post-flop street, which lets you realize more of your equity and control the pot size. The beauty of building ranges by position is that it gives you a repeatable plan. You do not have to guess every time. You know that under the gun, you are tight. In the cutoff, you are much looser. This structure is what keeps you from drifting into bad habits or getting swept away by the table's mood. It's also how you start seeing the game as a set of overlapping possibilities, not just a collection of single hands. But the real world is never that clean. Not all players stick to textbook ranges. Some players are tighter than average. Others are loose and unpredictable. That's where you need to start adjusting your own hand ranges and the ranges you assign to others based on what you observe. Let's talk about opponent tendencies. If you spot a player who only opens the pot from early position with premium holdings, think big pairs and ace-king, they're working with a very tight value-oriented range. That means when they raise, you need to give that action a lot of respect. You might decide to fold hands you would usually play, or only call or raise with your absolute best hands, because the likelihood of running into a monster is much higher here. Now imagine a player who is loose, opening a lot of hands from every position, calling down with all sorts of holdings, and generally putting chips in the pot with little regard for hand strength. Their range is much wider and includes a lot of weaker hands. Against this type of player, you might tighten up your calling range a bit, since their bluffs and weak holdings mean you do not want to get trapped with medium-strength hands. On the other hand, you can widen your re-raising range, applying more pressure and picking up pots when they fold their lower half. What you're really doing is shaping and reshaping the hand range you assign to each player at the table, in real time. Every action, whether it's a raise, a call, or a fold, sends a signal about what that player might be holding. If a player makes a large raise from early position, that's usually a sign of strength. If they limp in from late position and then call a big raise, their range is likely weaker. These patterns are not static. As you play more hands with someone, you gather more information, and you should keep updating your assumptions. The more you notice about how often someone opens, how often they call, and especially what they show down at the end, the more accurate your range assignments become. There's another layer here. Sometimes, a player's range is described as linear or polarized. A linear range is just the best hands in order, top to bottom, with no big jumps. A polarized range is the opposite. Lots of strong hands and bluffs, but not much in the middle. You'll see this most clearly in post-flop situations, but it does influence pre-flop thinking too. If you're up against someone who only ever raises with monsters or total junk, you need to be careful with your medium-strength hands. If they're raising with a smooth range of good hands, you can respond more confidently with your own strong hands. Now let's put this all to use in how you decide whether to call or raise before the flop. Once you've built your own range for your seat and assigned a likely range to your opponent, you can compare them. If your range is stronger than what you think your opponent is playing, raising is often the best play. You're building a pot when you expect to have the equity advantage. If your hand is in the middle of your range, or if you're facing a tight early position open, calling can make more sense. You may have enough equity to continue, but not enough to risk getting 3-bet or building a big pot out of position. Let's say you're on the button, and a player in middle position opens. You know from experience that this player is on the tighter side, so their range is probably around 15% of hands, maybe a little less. You look at your own hand, and see it is right on the edge of your normal button opening range, which could be up to 40% of hands. If you only call here, you're putting chips in against a range that is mostly strong hands, and you'll be playing post-flop in position. If you raise, you need to be sure your hand is strong enough to handle a possible 4-bet, or at least to take down the pot when they fold their weaker holdings. This is where interpreting the opponent's range becomes crucial. If you misread a tight player as loose and call or raise too wide, you're going to run into trouble. You'll be up against strong hands more often than you expect, and you'll lose money in the long run. On the flip side, if you fold too often against a loose player who is opening with all sorts of junk, you're missing opportunities to pick up easy pots, or to play against hands that are worse than yours. What you want is a consistent process. When you always think in ranges, you're less likely to let emotion or tilt creep into your decisions. You do not have to guess or make a hero call based on a hunch. You look at the position, the action, the tendencies, and you build a picture of what hands are in play. Then you make your decision based on how your hand fits into that landscape. Over time, this approach becomes second nature. You'll find yourself automatically narrowing down what hands make sense for each opponent, updating as each new piece of information comes in. You'll also start to recognize when your own range is too tight or too loose for a given situation, and you'll be able to adjust on the fly. This is the foundation for all higher-level poker thinking. Once you're comfortable constructing and adjusting ranges, you'll be ready to tackle more advanced concepts like 3-bet and 4-bet scenarios, post-flop range narrowing, and exploiting specific player weaknesses. For now, focus on building that habit. When you sit down to play, ask yourself, what is my range here? What is their range? How do these compare? Keep that question alive in every hand, and you'll find that your game becomes steadier, more logical, and a lot less stressful. Every decision you make and every action you observe is a thread in a larger pattern. The more you train yourself to see those threads through the lens of ranges, the clearer the game becomes. It rewards patience, observation, and discipline, and that investment pays off hand by hand. Chapter 4. Evaluating pot odds and equity. It gets tempting to think that if you know what hands you should play from each position, you're already most of the way there. The real progress starts when you see that knowing which hands belong in your range is only the surface layer. To actually turn those ranges into profit, you need a way to weigh whether entering a pot is worth the risk. That's where the math comes in, and where instinct starts to take a back seat. There are two tools that let you make these decisions with confidence. The first is called pot odds, and the second is equity. You'll use both of them together every time you face a bet or a raise before the flop. Let's start with pot odds. Pot odds are really just about price. Every time you face a bet, the pot is offering you a price to continue. It's the ratio between the amount you'd have to call and the total amount you could win if you call, and the hand goes to showdown. When you hear people talk about getting 3-1 or 4-1 on a call, they're talking about pot odds. To figure out the pot odds in a typical pre-flop spot, you need to know three numbers. First, the size of the pot before the action comes to you. Second, the size of the bet or raise you're facing. Third, the amount you'd need to call if you want to continue. You add together the pot, your opponent's bet, and your own call. That total is the new pot size, if you call. The ratio is then the total pot you could win compared to the amount you need to risk. Let's say there's $30 in the pot after your opponent raises. You're facing a $10 call. If you call, the pot will be $40. So you're risking $10 to try to win $40. That's a 4-1 ratio. In percentage terms, you take your call amount, which is $10. Divide it by the final pot size, $40, and then multiply by 100. That gives you 25%. So in this example, the pot is offering you 4-to-1 odds, or a 25% price. This means you need to win at least 1 out of every 5 times to break even on the call. If you can win more often than that, calling is profitable in the long run. If you win less often, you're losing money on the call over time. A key thing to remember is that you never count your own call as part of the amount you can win. The pot odds calculation is always about the risk you're taking compared to what's already in the middle, plus your opponent's bet. This makes the process very straightforward before the flop, because there are usually only a couple of bets in the pot. With some practice, you'll be able to estimate pot odds in your head without having to run the numbers every time. Now let's talk about equity. This is the second half of the equation, and it's just as important as pot odds. Equity is your share of the pot, if you could see all the cards and run the hand out to the river, a huge number of times. It's expressed as a percentage, and it tells you how often your hand would win or tie against your opponent's range. Before the flop, you rarely know your opponent's exact hand. Instead, you estimate what range of hands they could have based on their position and the actions so far. That's where all the work you've done on range construction comes into play. Once you have an idea of the hands they're likely to hold, you can use an equity calculator to see how your hand stacks up against that range. For example, if you know your opponent only raises with strong hands from early position, their range will be much narrower than if they're raising from the button. Your equity against a tight range is usually lower than against a wide range. That's why getting the range estimate right is so important. Equity depends on what you think your opponent is actually holding, not just what's possible. It's also worth pointing out that equity isn't static. It shifts as the ranges change. If your opponent is aggressive and raises a lot of hands, your hand will have more equity than if they are only playing premium holdings. That's why understanding how to build and adjust ranges is a skill that keeps paying off. Equity by itself doesn't tell you whether you should call. What it gives you is a percentage, a raw number that you can compare to the equity requirements set by the pot odds. The decision comes down to whether your hand's equity against your opponent's range is high enough to justify the call. If it is, the call makes sense mathematically. If it isn't, folding is the better choice. Let's tie these two concepts together. Pot odds tell you the minimum equity you need for a call to be profitable. Equity tells you how likely you are to win the pot if you call. The real power comes from comparing them directly. If your equity meets or exceeds the threshold set by your pot odds, you're making a good call in the long run. If it falls short, you're losing money over time. You'll see plenty of situations where the pot odds look attractive, but your hand just doesn't have enough equity against your opponent's range. Maybe you're getting 4-to-1, but your hand only has a 15% chance to win. Calling in those spots feels tempting, but it's a leak that adds up. Other times, your hand might have enough equity, but the pot odds are so poor that calling doesn't pay off. Both mistakes are common, and both can be avoided by always running the comparison. It's the balance between pot odds and equity that keeps you from making these expensive errors. When you use both tools together, you're not guessing. You're using a disciplined process that gives you a repeatable edge. Over time, this is what separates players who rely on feel from those who build real, sustainable profit at the tables. There's no shortcut around this foundation. Every profitable cash game strategy is built on the ability to quickly estimate pot odds, assign a realistic range to your opponent, and judge your hand's equity against that range. This is the lens you'll use to evaluate every pre-flop call, And it's the same lens you'll use when deciding whether to raise or fold. Once you've got these calculations down, you'll notice your confidence growing in spots that used to feel uncomfortable. The numbers will guide you, and your instincts will start to line up with the math. You won't feel lost when the action gets fast, because you'll know how to break down any situation into the same simple steps. What's the price? What's my equity? And does one cover the other? This way of thinking turns every pre-flop decision into a manageable problem, not a gamble. It keeps you grounded, even when the pressure is on. As you move forward, you'll see that every advanced concept, whether it's calling, re-raising, or folding, comes back to this same process. Pot odds and equity are not just tools. They're the ground you stand on. Let yourself get comfortable with this math. The game slows down when you do. Each pot becomes an opportunity to apply what you know, not just a test of nerves. It starts to feel less like you're making bets in the dark, and more like you're solving a puzzle you understand. That's the calm you want to bring to every hand. Let it settle in, and keep the numbers close as you go. Chapter 5. Leveraging Fold Equity. When you are sitting at the table and thinking about whether to raise or just call before the flop, you are probably already weighing your hand's chance of winning at showdown. That is your equity. You know that's your share of the pot, in the long run, if you and your opponent both go to the river and turn your cards over. But there is another piece to the puzzle that can make aggressive play so much more profitable. That is fold equity. Fold equity is the extra value you get when there is a real chance your opponent will fold to your bet or raise. It is not about what happens if you get called. It is about what happens when your opponent decides to let their hand go and you win the pot right there, no showdown needed. When you raise pre-flop, you are giving yourself two ways to win. You can have the best hand at showdown, or you can make everyone else fold and scoop the pot uncontested. That second path is what fold equity captures. If you just call pre-flop, you are never making anyone fold, so you are playing only for your showdown equity. But when you raise, you force your opponents to make a decision. If they fold, you win the whole pot, even if your cards were behind. That is why raising tends to be more profitable than calling in many spots, even when your hand is not a favorite to win at showdown, provided you have identified genuine fold equity in the situation. You are adding the chance of an immediate win to your expected value, not just relying on your cards. Fold equity is not something you can count on being the same every hand. It shifts around, depending on who you are up against, how deep the stacks are, and what the table feels like. Some players fold too much, some never fold, and the size of your raise can push those numbers up or down. When you are thinking about making an aggressive play, you want to weigh your fold equity before you commit your chips. It is not just a feeling or a general sense of pressure. It is a concrete part of your expected value calculation. The more often your opponent folds, the more value you add to your raise, and that can turn a marginal hand into a moneymaker. You will see fold equity at its best in certain pre-flop situations. If you are on the button and everyone else has folded, you are in a prime spot. You have position, and the only players left to act are usually sitting in the blinds. If those blind players have shown a tendency to fold, you can generate a lot of fold equity with a simple raise. Even if your cards are not strong, the chance to win the pot right away can make the play profitable. But not every table is the same. If you are playing with people who call everything, your fold equity goes way down. Loose, sticky players do not give up easily, so a raise is only good if your hand can stand up at showdown. On the other hand, if the table is full of tight, cautious players, especially in the blinds, you can ramp up your aggression and expect to see more folds. Your table image matters too. If you have not been caught bluffing and have been stealing pots quietly, your opponents might give you more credit and fold more often. 3-bet situations are another place where fold equity can really shine. When you re-raise before the flop, you are telling your opponent you have a much stronger hand. Many players respect a 3-bet as a signal of significant strength, which tends to produce more folds than a single raise, particularly against opponents playing a wide opening range. That means you can pick up more pots, uncontested, especially if your opponent's opening range is wide and full of hands that cannot stand a lot of pressure. Stack sizes also play a big part in how much fold equity you have. If you or your opponent have only a few chips left, you are not going to get many folds. Players with short stacks are often pot committed, so even if they do not love their hand, the math might push them to call. When stacks are very deep, things get more complicated. Opponents with a lot of chips might call more often, hoping to hit something big, but those deep stacks also let you apply more pressure with bigger bets. You will also find that fold equity is most effective when the pot has not grown too large. If there are already a few callers before you act, it is much harder to get everyone to fold with a single raise. The more people in the pot, the less pressure a single bet applies, and the more likely you are to get called somewhere. Now, when you are trying to figure out whether your raise will work, you need to pay attention to who you are up against and where they are sitting. Players in early position have already shown strength by playing from up front, so their ranges are usually tighter. If you try to push them off a hand, you might run into resistance. Players in late position, especially if they are trying to steal the blinds, have a lot more weak and marginal hands in their range. That makes them better targets for fold equity plays, especially if you 3-bet them. Stack size is another piece to watch. When you put in a big raise and your opponent is sitting on a short stack, they might just shove all in or call, since folding would mean giving up too much of their stack. But if their stack is big enough that they are not committed, a well-sized raise can really pressure them to fold hands they would rather see a cheap flop with. The sweet spot is when your bet is large enough to make calling uncomfortable, but not so big that you are forcing your opponent to go all in. To really get the most out of fold equity, you have to think about what your opponent might be holding. That is their range. If their range is full of strong hands, even a large bet is unlikely to generate many folds, since they have too much to gain by continuing. But if you know their range is mostly weak holdings, or capped at hands that do not want to play big pots, your pressure can force a lot of folds. That is why watching how your opponents play is so important. If someone limps a lot and folds to raises, you know you can push them around. If someone never folds, you need a real hand to get involved. Previous actions tell you a lot too. If a player raised and got called, then checked, they might be signaling weakness. That is a good spot to apply pressure. If someone has been raising every hand, you know their range is wide and full of hands that cannot stand up to a big bet. That is where fold equity can become a real weapon. When you are thinking about how much to bet, you can use break-even math to figure out how often you need your opponent to fold for your play to work immediately. For example, if you raise to 3 big blinds into a pot of 1.5 big blinds, your opponent needs to fold about 67% of the time for your raise to break even on the spot, since you are risking 3 big blinds to win 1.5. If you make a smaller raise, like 1 big blind into a 1.5 big blind pot, you only need folds about 40% of the time. That is a useful way to check whether your play makes sense given what you know about your opponent. So every time you are sitting there looking for an edge before the flop, remember that you do not have to rely on having the best cards. If you can spot the right situations, size your bets well, and target the right players. Fold equity lets you win pots your hand might not deserve. Aggression pays off when you know how to use it, and fold equity is the reason why. Slow down, watch how players react to pressure, and let their tendencies show you where the next opportunity is waiting. Chapter 6. Adjusting for stack sizes. When you sit down at a cash game table, the size of your stack compared to the blinds quietly shapes every decision you make before the flop. Even if you understand how fold equity lets you win pots without always having the best hand, that fold equity looks very different when you have a small stack versus a deep one. How many chips you have behind is not just a detail, it is a lens that colors every pre-flop choice. Stack depth is one of those fundamental things that separates casual players from thoughtful ones, because it forces you to pay attention not just to your cards but to context. Let's get into how adjusting for stack sizes will help you make sharper, more profitable pre-flop decisions in cash game hold'em. Picture yourself with a short stack, which in most cash games means you have 40 big blinds or less. This is not much breathing room, and that tight space puts your whole approach under a microscope. Every chip feels precious, because the margin for error shrinks dramatically. When you raise or call pre-flop with a short stack, the pot-to-stack ratio jumps up quickly, and suddenly you face tough choices about whether to commit the rest of your stack after the flop. That pressure to commit means you want to avoid hands that leave you guessing or chasing. Instead, you tighten up your starting hand selection, sticking to holdings that can either make strong top pairs or apply meaningful pressure right away. It is not just about playing fewer hands, though. It is about playing the right hands and playing them aggressively. If you have around 20 big blinds or less, a common guideline is to favor a raise or fold approach rather than calling. Calling with a small stack often leaves you stuck with awkward decisions because you are already so invested that folding later feels painful, but your hand may not be strong enough to continue. Raising or re-raising gives you a chance to win the pot outright, or go to the flop with the initiative. Speculative hands, like suited connectors or small suited gappers, lose a lot of their appeal here. With a short stack, you simply do not have enough chips behind to chase draws or hope for big payoffs if you hit. When you do call, it should be with hands that can make top pair with a good kicker, or strong pocket pairs that stand up well in all-in pots. The goal is not to outplay everyone after the flop, but to avoid putting yourself in spots where you are forced to gamble with marginal holdings. Position becomes even more important when you are short-stacked. Acting last gives you a huge edge, because it lets you see how your opponents respond before you commit precious chips. If you are out of position, you will often want to tighten up even further, only entering pots with hands that play well in a compressed stack environment. Playing from late position with a short stack lets you be the aggressor, which increases your fold equity and puts your opponents to tough decisions. Aggression is your friend here. By raising or re-raising, you maximize your chances to win the pot before the flop or to get heads up against a single opponent. Passive play, like limping or calling, often leaves you in tough spots where you are either pot committed with a weak hand or forced to fold away your short stack. In these situations, discipline and clarity are key. You want to keep your range tight, favoring hands that can win at showdown or generate immediate fold equity, and you want to be the one driving the action whenever possible. Now imagine your stack has grown, and you are sitting with something between 40 and 100 big blinds. This is the medium stack zone, and it is probably the most common stack depth you will see in live cash games. Here, your options open up a bit, but you are still not playing with total freedom. The key with a medium stack is finding the right balance between aggression and caution. You can start to widen your opening ranges, especially from late position, and include some hands that would be too risky with a short stack. Because you have more chips behind, you are not forced to commit your whole stack as quickly after a pre-flop raise, and that flexibility makes it possible to play a wider mix of hands profitably. Position matters even more here. Being in late position with a medium stack lets you open raise a wider range, because you have the advantage of acting last and the room to maneuver after the flop. If you are in early position, you will still want to be more selective, since you are more likely to face resistance and tougher post-flop spots. 3-betting comes into play more often at these stack depths, but with a twist. Because the stack-to-pot ratio is lower than with deep stacks, 3-bet ranges tend to be more value-heavy. It is harder to profitably 3-bet bluff with suited connectors or small suited aces, since the reduced implied odds make it less likely you will get paid off if you hit a disguised hand. That said, you can still look for spots to apply pressure, especially if you notice opponents are opening too wide or folding too often to 3-bets. Medium stacks also reward careful attention to how much of your stack is at risk. You do not want to overcommit with marginal hands, but you do want to seize opportunities to exploit opponents who are playing too passively. If you are in late position and the action folds to you, you can often open raise with a wider range, knowing you have enough chips to back up your aggression with post-flop play. If someone raises ahead of you, you should weigh the strength of your hand, your position, and the likelihood that you can leverage your stack to force mistakes. Implied odds start to matter more, but they are not as significant as with deep stacks. Calling with suited connectors or small pocket pairs can still be profitable, but only if you are confident that you can get paid off when you hit your hand. If the pre-flop raise is large, or you are out of position, the potential reward may not justify the risk. The most profitable medium stack players are those who stay alert to changing stack sizes, adapt their ranges accordingly, and use position to tilt the odds in their favor. Now let's talk about deep stack play, which usually means you have at least 150 big blinds, though some games treat 100 big blinds as the start of deep stack territory. This is where the game starts to feel wide open, and the possibilities multiply. With a deep stack, your pre-flop strategy can become much more creative, because you have the ammunition to chase implied odds and play for big pots when you hit a strong hand. One of the biggest advantages of having a deep stack is the ability to call or raise with speculative hands that have the potential to win huge pots. Suited connectors, small pairs, and suited gappers become much more attractive, because if you hit a disguised monster, there is enough money behind to make it worth your while. For example, the chance of flopping a set with a pocket pair is roughly 1 in 8, or about 11.8%. To make set mining profitable, a commonly cited guideline is to look for implied odds of roughly 10 to 1 or better against the pre-flop raise, meaning you hope to win at least 10 times the amount you called when you hit your set, which deep stacks can provide. If both you and your opponent have deep stacks, you can afford to call with those small pairs, knowing that if you hit a set, you might win a very large pot. Suited connectors are another class of hand that benefit from deep stacks. With at least 100 big blinds, and especially at 150 or more, calling pre-flop raises with suited connectors can be profitable. Generally speaking, the deeper the stacks, the more you may be able to justify calling with lower suited connectors, since the potential reward for hitting a big hand grows alongside the effective stack size. Of course, you want to be in position whenever possible, since acting last lets you control the size of the pot and extract maximum value when you hit. Deep stacks also expand your options for aggressive pre-flop play. 3-betting and 4-betting become potent tools, especially against opponents who are too loose or predictable. The threat of losing a large stack puts real pressure on your opponents, and you can use that to your advantage by targeting players who fold too often to big raises or who call too wide. Your 3-bet bluffs and value bets both gain more leverage because the stakes are higher and the decisions are more difficult for your opponents. Position becomes even more of a weapon with deep stacks. When you act last, you get to see how your opponents respond before making your own decision, and you can use that information to extract value or manage risk. If you have a strong hand, you can build the pot and go for maximum value. If you have a speculative hand, you can take free cards or control the pot size, avoiding overcommitting when you miss. The ability to play more streets with deep stacks means your positional advantage compounds, letting you outmaneuver opponents over the course of the hand. Mastering stack size adjustments is not just about memorizing ranges or following a chart. It is about recognizing how the chips in front of you change the risk and reward of every preflop decision. When you are short-stacked, you want to play tight and aggressive, only entering pots with hands that can win at showdown or push opponents off their hands. With a medium stack, you can open up your ranges a bit, but you still need to be careful about how much of your stack you risk. Deep stacks let you get creative, playing more speculative hands and using position to your advantage, because the potential rewards are so much greater. Each stack depth offers its own possibilities and pitfalls. The more you pay attention to your effective stack size and adapt your preflop strategy, the more control you will have over your results. Adjusting for stack sizes is one of the most reliable ways to sharpen your edge at the table, giving you the flexibility to profit in whatever situation the table presents. The next time you sit down, take a moment before the first hand to note the effective stack sizes at the table. As chips move and stacks shift, let that awareness guide your range construction in real time. The players who do this consistently are the ones who seem calm under pressure, not because the game gets easier, but because they have already done the work before the cards are even dealt. Chapter 7: Exploiting Weak Opponents. By now, position and stack depth are part of how you see every hand. Those fundamentals do not disappear here, but they become the backdrop for something sharper, reading the specific people sitting across from you. But once you have that foundation, the real edge comes from watching the people at your table. In a live cash game, the biggest profits rarely come from memorized ranges or perfect math. They come from seeing what other players miss, little patterns, repeated habits, and the subtle signals that show you exactly who is making mistakes before the cards are even dealt. It starts with observation. The most profitable players do not wait for a showdown to start learning about their opponents. They watch every showdown, every bet size, and every hesitation. Over time, you notice that some players act before their turn, fidget with chips in certain spots, or announce their intentions with the way they handle their cards. Weak players often become easier to identify once you know the behavioral patterns to watch for. They tend to call preflop raises much more often than tight or aggressive players. Their bet sizes bounce around without any clear logic. You might see someone min-raise a strong hand and then suddenly overbet with a weak one, or limp in with hands that should be folded from early position. When someone limps in the first seat, that is a classic sign of a player who does not understand the power of position or the risks involved. Every time you spot one of these tendencies, you are quietly building a mental profile. The longer you watch, the more reliable that profile becomes. What matters most is that you do not jump to conclusions after a single hand. True exploitation comes from cataloging these behaviors over many orbits, not from reacting impulsively to one odd play. Weak opponents tend to repeat the same mistakes, especially before the flop. One of the most common errors is over-limping. You will see players limp in from early position, middle position, and even the cutoff, hoping to see a cheap flop with speculative hands. This passive approach makes them easy targets for isolation, raises from late position. If you are sitting in the button or cutoff and notice 2 or 3 limpers ahead, you can often take the pot down outright, or play heads up against someone who is likely to make more mistakes later in the hand. The key is that their limp signals a lack of confidence or understanding, and most of the time, their hand is too weak to withstand real pressure. Another mistake you will see is a reluctance to fold to 3 bets. Some weak players call 3 bets with hands that are easily dominated, like weak aces or king-jack offsuit. When this happens, you get to build a big pot with a strong hand, while your opponent is stuck with a hand that is trailing from the start. Not every weak player reacts the same way, though. Some will overfold to 3 bets, giving up too often, and letting you take down pots without resistance. Others may respond unpredictably, but over many hands, these patterns start to show themselves. The important thing is that once you spot a weak player who calls too many 3 bets, you can tighten your 3-bet range to focus on hands that really dominate their calling range, rather than bluffing with hands that are only marginally ahead. Open raise sizing is another area where weak players give themselves away. You might see someone min-raise with pocket aces and then raise 6 times the big blind with king-10 offsuit. This lack of consistency tells you that their sizing is tied to their hand strength, not to any broader strategy. When you know that a player only uses big sizes with weak hands, you can respond with well-timed calls or re-raises. If they use small sizes with strong hands, you can proceed with more caution, or even fold marginal holdings that would otherwise be playable. Blind defense is another common leak. Some weak players fold their blinds far too often, giving up equity and letting you steal without a fight. Others call with almost anything, creating spots where you can isolate them with a wide value range and expect to make money over time. These mistakes are not always dramatic, but they add up quickly when you exploit them consistently. Observation builds the profile. Now the question is how to act on it, before the cards are even dealt. The biggest adjustment you can make against weak players is to widen your value range and tighten up on bluffs. Since weak players love to call, bluffing too often becomes a losing strategy. Instead, focus on hands that play well after the flop and can make strong pairs or better. When you see a player limp in, especially from early position, isolation raising from late position becomes one of your most profitable plays. In a typical $1, $2 live cash game, a common isolation raise over a single limper falls in the range of $8 to $15, with many coaches recommending adding roughly 1 big blind per additional limper at the table. The exact size depends on the table and your read on the limpers, but the goal is always to get heads up with position against someone likely to make post-flop mistakes. 3 betting for value is another key adjustment. Against players who call 3 bets with too many hands, you want to be selective and stick to hands that are well ahead of their calling range. In these spots, the priority should be value rather than bluffing. Focus on hands like ace-king, ace-queen suited, or big pairs that dominate a wide calling range. These hands will dominate the types of hands weak players call with, and you will find yourself in favorable situations much more often. The opposite is true if you spot a player who folds too often to 3 bets. In those cases, you can widen your 3-bet range and pick up pots with less resistance, but always be ready to adjust if their pattern changes. Position amplifies everything discussed so far. When you are in the cutoff, or on the button, against a weak opponent, your informational advantage is at its peak, and weak players rarely adjust their strategy based on where you are sitting. Weak players rarely adjust their strategy based on your position, so you get to exploit their static approach again and again. Over time, the edge from position compounds, especially when you are targeting the right opponents with well-chosen hands. Patience is what ties it all together. You do not need to play every hand or force action with marginal holdings, just because you have spotted a weak opponent. The real profits come from waiting for the right spots and capitalizing when they appear. Sometimes, several orbits will pass before the perfect situation comes up. That is fine. Each fold, each observation, and each mental note brings you closer to a spot where your edge is at its highest. When you finally pick up a hand that fits the situation, a strong value hand against a known caller, or a perfect isolation spot against a serial limper, you are ready to make the most of it. The rhythm of live cash games rewards discipline. The room is full of distractions and noise, but real focus comes from watching the players, not just the cards. The soft clicking of chips, the casual table talk, and the repeated mistakes all carry information if you are paying attention. Over sessions, that attentiveness puts you in the right spots far more often than instinct alone. There is no need to rush. Just wait, watch, and let the patterns reveal themselves. The rest tends to follow. Chapter 8: Understanding 3-bet and 4-bet dynamics. When you spot a player who folds too often or limps into too many pots, you already know you can push them around with smart aggression. That's one of the first skills you pick up as you start to exploit weak opponents. Now let's take that foundation and look at how structured aggression before the flop, specifically 3-bets and 4-bets, lets you shape the game at a deeper level. A 3-bet is simply a re-raise after someone opens the pot with a raise. The action goes, someone puts in the first raise, then another player bumps it up again. That's the third bet, so we call it a 3-bet. A 4-bet is the next escalation, a re-raise over a 3-bet. Whenever you see those chips flying in before the flop and the pot starts growing quickly, it's usually because someone's pulled the trigger on a 3-bet or a 4-bet. These aren't just moves for show. When you 3-bet, you're using one of the most powerful levers in the game. You put the original raiser in a tight spot. They have to narrow their options. They can fold and give up, call and play a bigger pot, or raise again with a 4-bet. Each choice has real consequences. This pressure creates what's called fold equity. You're not just trying to see a flop with a good hand. Sometimes you want them to fold right now and let you take it down uncontested. 3-betting does more than just push people out of pots. It sets up the hands you want to play for value. When you 3-bet with your strongest hands, like 2 aces or 2 kings, you build a bigger pot and set yourself up to win more when your hand holds up. And by 3-betting with a mix of strong hands and some well-chosen bluffs, you keep opponents from knowing exactly what you have. That's where real pressure comes from: uncertainty. Now whoever 3-bets holds what we call an uncapped range. That means they still have all the strongest possible hands in their range. If someone just calls the original raise, they're often seen as capped. People expect that the best hands, 2 aces, 2 kings, maybe 2 queens, would have 3-bet, so a flat call usually doesn't include those. Skilled players sometimes call with premiums on purpose to mix things up, but most of the time that's how the ranges get defined. When a 4-bet comes in, things get even more serious. A 4-bet slams the brakes on wide aggression. It says, "I'm willing to play for stacks," or "I'm putting you to the test with a bluff." The range of hands that 4-bet is usually very tight, either the very best hands or an occasional bluff to keep your opponent guessing. This back and forth before the flop can reshape how everyone at the table views you. If you 3-bet and 4-bet with the right frequency, people start to respect your raises. They think twice before trying to steal your blinds or push you around. You can see how these moves ripple through the table, changing the way your opponents play against you in future hands. 3-betting and 4-betting are not just for building pots or scaring people. They help you control the size of the pot, define your range, and take the lead in the hand. When you're the one pushing the action, you set the tone. You're not just reacting to what others do. That's a big shift in how you approach the game. Now, these tools are only profitable when you use them in the right spots. You can't just fire off 3-bets and 4-bets at random and expect to come out ahead. The most profitable times to 3-bet or 4-bet usually come down to a few key factors: who you're up against, where you're sitting, and how the table's been playing. Let's start with your opponent. Some players open way too many hands from late position. They see the button or the cutoff and raise with almost anything. If you spot someone doing this, they're prime targets for 3-bet bluffs. They simply can't defend all those weak holdings when you apply pressure. Other players hate facing aggression. They fold to 3-bets almost every time. Against these folks, you can 3-bet with a wider, more polarized range, your best hands and some bluffs with blockers, like Ace-5 suited or King-5 suited. The key is that you're picking spots where their range is weak and their response is predictable. On the other hand, some players defend against 3-bets with a very wide range. They call, or even 4-bet, with hands that most wouldn't consider. Against these players, you need to tighten up. Focus on 3-betting with strong value hands and cut out the marginal bluffs. If they're not folding, your bluffs lose their power and you end up in tough spots with weak hands. Position is another huge factor. When you're in position, acting after your opponent for the rest of the hand, you get to see what they do before you make your decisions. This advantage lets you 3-bet a bit wider because you'll have more control if they call. When you're out of position, you have to play more cautiously. 3-bets from the blinds, for example, are often sized larger to compensate for the positional disadvantage, somewhere in the range of 3 to 4 times the original raise, though exact sizing varies by game and stack depth. In position, your sizing can be somewhat smaller, roughly 2.5 to 3 times the open, since post-flop position provides its own built-in advantage. This helps you keep the pot manageable and maintains your advantage. Table dynamics can shift things too. If you're at a table where nobody wants to play big pots, or people are folding to 3-bets all night, you can ramp up the aggression. Your bluffs become more profitable when nobody pushes back. But if the table is full of sticky players who love to see flops, you need to adjust. Firing off bluffs into a calling station is one of the more reliable ways to bleed chips quickly. Make it a habit to pay attention to how the table is responding, not just to your own cards. Good players rarely use a one-size-fits-all approach. They adjust their 3-bet and 4-bet strategy based on who raised, what position they're in, and how everyone's been playing. For example, 3-betting from the cutoff against an early position open should be tighter and more value-heavy than 3-betting from the blinds against a button open. Generally speaking, the earlier the position of the original raiser, the stronger their range tends to be, which is a good reason to lean toward a tighter 3-bet range against early position opens. When you see a 4-bet, you know the range is even more compressed. Most players only 4-bet with their absolute best hands, or as a well-timed bluff. If someone rarely 4-bets, you can fold the vast majority of your hands to their aggression, only continuing with your strongest holdings. On the other hand, if you spot a player who 4-bets a lot, you can defend more often, sometimes even 5-bet shoving if the stacks are right, but that's a deeper topic for another time. Let's talk about defending against this kind of aggression, because you'll be on the receiving end of 3-bets and 4-bets just as often as you're dishing them out. The biggest mistake most players make is either folding too much or calling too much. If you fold every time someone 3-bets you, you're giving up way too much equity. You become an easy target, and sharp players will start 3-betting you relentlessly. On the flip side, if you call every 3-bet just to see a flop, you end up in bloated pots, often out of position, with hands that don't play well after the flop. That's a recipe for losing money in the long run. The best defense is a balanced one. You want a mix of hands that can call and see a flop profitably, as well as hands strong enough to 4-bet for value or as a bluff. Hands that play well in position, like suited connectors or suited broadways, can be good calls against certain 3-bets, especially if you have post-flop skill and the stacks are deep enough. Out of position, you need to tighten up. Only call or 4-bet with hands that have real strength or good blocking potential. For example, ace-king suited or 2 queens are strong candidates to continue out of position, either by calling or 4-betting, depending on the opponent and the situation. Position really does shape your defense range. In position, you can float more often, seeing how your opponent acts on the flop before committing more chips. Out of position, you're at a disadvantage, so your range should be much tighter and more value-heavy. It's not just about the cards you hold, it's about how well those cards can realize their equity, given your position and the strength of your opponent's range. Now, the heart of this balancing act is understanding expected value. That's the average amount you expect to win or lose with a given play, based on all the possible outcomes. If you only defend against 3-bets with your absolute best hands, you let opponents print money by bluffing you. If you defend too wide, you bleed chips in tough spots. The trick is to find that middle ground. Fold the hands that don't make enough money to continue, call or 4-bet with hands that do, and always adjust based on what you've observed from your opponent. If you're up against a player who mostly 3-bets for value, you can fold more of your weaker hands. There's no shame in giving up when the math is against you. But you should still continue with your strong hands, either by calling or 4-betting, to make sure your opponent can't just run you over. If you spot someone 3-betting with a lot of bluffs, widen your defense range accordingly. Maybe you start calling with hands like ace-queen suited or king-queen suited, or you add in some 4-bet bluffs of your own. This approach prevents your opponents from getting comfortable. If they know you'll fight back, they have to think twice before firing off another 3-bet or 4-bet. The goal is to make sure nobody at the table feels like they can push you around without facing resistance. Mastering these dynamics isn't about memorizing charts or copying what you see on a stream. It's about understanding the flow of the game, when to press, when to hold back, and how to keep your range balanced so you're tough to play against. Once you get a feel for how 3-bets and 4-bets shape the action, you'll find yourself more comfortable in big pots, more confident in your decisions, and more respected at the table. Let those ideas settle for a moment. Think about how each of these actions changes the conversation at the table before the flop. With a little patience and practice, you'll start to see the whole game open up, one calculated raise at a time. Chapter 9: The Importance of Image and Table Dynamics. Every time you put chips in the pot before the flop, you are writing a sentence in the story your opponents are reading about you. By now you have accumulated a history at this table. Raises made, folds shown, hands won and lost. That history has weight, and it is called your table image. Either way, your choices are building something bigger than the results of any single hand. They are building your table image. When we talk about table image, we are talking about the story your opponents tell themselves about you, based on every hand you have played, every bet you have made, and every fold you have shown. It is a living thing that changes as the session unfolds. Some players might label you as tight if you have been folding more than most and only getting involved with strong starting hands. Others might decide you are loose if you have been raising a lot and playing a wide range of hands. These labels are not just for show. They guide how your opponents respond to you before the flop. Let us say you have built a tight image. That means you have been folding most hands and only entering pots with what looks like premium holdings. The players around you start to believe that if you are raising, you must have something big. They react by folding more often to your pre-flop bets and raises, making it harder to get paid when you finally pick up those monster hands. However, when they do choose to play back at you, they will usually have something strong themselves. Sometimes a sharp opponent will even notice your tightness and start to push back with bluffs, trying to take advantage of your selectiveness. On the other hand, if you have been active and involved in a lot of pots, your table image will skew loose. Opponents will notice when you have raised several hands in a row or shown down some questionable starting hands. Now, when you raise, you are much more likely to get called or even 3-bet. They are not giving you credit for big hands every time. In fact, some players will start to widen their own ranges against you, looking to punish what they see as reckless play. This makes it tougher to steal blinds or win pots uncontested. What is important to see here is that your image is not set in stone. It can shift quickly, sometimes within a single orbit, especially if you have just shown down a big bluff or made an unusual play that catches everyone's attention. Your opponents are always updating their read on you. Sometimes they overreact to a single hand. Other times, they miss a trend because they are not paying close enough attention. Either way, their perception of you is shaping their decisions every time you put chips in the pot. Your image does not exist in isolation. The entire table has its own shifting personality, and understanding that broader dynamic is just as important as managing how you are individually perceived. The mood and flow of a table can change a lot during a session. Maybe you started out at a quiet, passive table where nobody wanted to put in big bets without the nuts. Then, a couple of aggressive players sit down, and suddenly there are 3 bets and 4 bets flying around. Or maybe a player who lost a big pot tightens up, while another gets confident and starts opening every hand. All of these shifts are part of the table dynamic. If you want to stay ahead, you have to notice when these shifts are happening. Watch for players who are changing gears. Maybe someone was folding a lot, but now they are 3-betting your opens. Or maybe a player who was raising every hand has suddenly gone quiet after a tough loss. Each of these changes should make you reconsider your own pre-flop strategy. Let us say you have been folding for several orbits, and the player to your left starts stealing your blinds every time. That is not an accident. They have noticed your tightness and are trying to exploit it. If you keep playing the same way, you are going to keep getting run over. The right move might be to start opening your range, calling more 3-bets, or even putting in the occasional 4-bet bluff, just to slow them down. Stack sizes are another layer of the dynamic. As covered earlier, deeper stacks invite more speculative pre-flop action, while shorter stacks push play toward commitment and all-ins. What is worth adding here is that your stack size also colors your image. A big stack can command respect or attract aggression, depending on the players around you. If you have a big stack, some players may give you more respect, while others may see you as a target. The key is that table dynamics are never static. You cannot set your strategy at the start of a session and expect it to work all night. You have to keep recalibrating as the players and the action change. Sometimes that means tightening up when the table gets wild. Other times, it means loosening up when everyone else is playing scared. If you are not paying attention, you risk missing these shifts, and the edge you have built can quietly erode. Once you understand how your image and the table dynamic interact, you can start to use them as tools, not just things that happen to you. Manipulating your image is about more than just playing your cards. It is about controlling the story your opponents are telling themselves about you. Let us say you have been folding for a while, and the table sees you as a rock. If you pick just the right moment to open with a weak hand, you might get everyone to fold because they assume you are only playing the nuts. If you pull off a well-timed bluff and show it, you may loosen your image in the eyes of attentive opponents, which can set you up to get paid on strong hands later in the session. The trick is to make these shifts when the table is watching, like after a showdown or a dramatic hand. That is when the impression will stick. It works the other way too. If you have been splashing around and building a loose image, you can suddenly tighten up. Now when you do raise, your opponents might finally give you credit and fold hands that would have played back at you before. That gives you room to steal pots or pick your spots for value. Timing matters here. If you try to change gears when nobody is paying attention, you will not get the effect you want. You can also use your position relative to other players to shape your image. If you are on the button and 3-betting a frequent opener in late position, you will start to look more aggressive, even if your actual range is strong. Some players will adjust quickly, others will not. How you exploit that depends on how well you are reading the table. The point is, manipulating your image is not about being sneaky for its own sake. It is about making sure your opponents are reacting the way you want, so you can make more profitable decisions before the flop. Sometimes you want folds, sometimes you want calls, and sometimes you want to induce mistakes. The more you control the narrative, the more you control the action. Awareness of perception is not just a soft skill or an afterthought. It is a real lever you can pull every time you make a call or a raise. If you pay attention to how you are being seen and to how the table as a whole is shifting around you, you will find yourself making better decisions hand after hand. Over time, that edge adds up, quietly shaping your results in ways that go far beyond the cards themselves. The real skill is not in the cards you are dealt, but in how clearly you can read the room and adjust. Slow down, watch, and pay attention to what the table is telling you. The more accurately you see the dynamics at play, the more deliberately you can steer them. Chapter 10: Common Preflop Mistakes and How to Avoid Them. When you start thinking about how other players see you at the table, you realize that image only matters if you actually play your hands in a way that makes sense. You can know exactly how tight or loose you look, but if you keep making the same mechanical mistakes before the flop, that awareness is not going to save you. The biggest leaks in cash games almost always start before the flop is even dealt, and most players never notice how much these habits cost them over time. Let's talk about the patterns that show up again and again at cash tables. The first one is trying to play too many hands, especially from early positions. When you sit under the gun and decide to limp in with a hand that looks okay but is really just weak high cards, you are setting yourself up for trouble. These hands frequently run into stronger opening ranges, and when you do hit the flop, you often make a second best hand. It feels harmless in the moment, but every time you call with a weak ace or king-jack offsuit from early position, you are inviting opponents to attack your range with bigger bets and squeezes. Over hundreds of hands, that little leak turns into a steady drain on your stack. Another mistake that pops up everywhere is open limping. When you just pay the minimum to see a flop without raising, you are signaling to observant opponents that you likely do not have a premium hand, since strong players typically open with a raise. Strong players notice this and isolate you with raises or bring more players into the pot. Now you are playing out of position, without initiative, and your weak range is exposed. It is no accident that open limping is seen as a recreational towler. It removes your ability to represent strength later on and makes post-flop decisions much harder. There is also a tendency to call raises too often before the flop, especially when others have already called. You see a raise and two callers, and it feels like you are getting a good price with a hand like Queen 10 suited. But the reality is that you are entering a multi-way pot with a hand that is often dominated, and you are probably out of position. These calls look innocent, but they put you in spots where your kicker is not good enough, or you are drawing dead to a better hand. Over time, calling with hands that make top pair but have a weak kicker, like King Jack offsuit, leads to big losses. You end up making hands that look strong, but someone else has you beat and can extract value from you across multiple streets. Improper 3-bet sizing is another leak that is easy to miss. If you make your 3-bets too small, you let your opponents call with a wide range and see a cheap flop, which means you are not getting the folds you want when you are bluffing or protecting a value hand. On the other hand, going too big with your 3-bets can bloat the pot with hands that are not strong enough to play for stacks pre-flop. Both mistakes make it hard to build pots effectively with your strong hands, and can leave you guessing when you miss the flop. A lot of these mistakes come from not understanding position and what it means for your starting hand choices. When you ignore position, you end up playing the same hands from early seats as you would from late position, which is a recipe for getting picked apart by players who pay attention. The strongest ranges should generally come from early position, and you should be folding or raising, not limping or calling, with anything that cannot stand up to aggression. Passive pre-flop play, like limping or flat calling when you should be raising, is one of the most damaging habits you can develop at a cash game table. When you limp in, you give up the chance to take control of the hand. You let more players see the flop, which means your hand has to be even stronger to win at showdown. If you do end up making a big hand later, it is much harder to build the pot, because you did not show strength before the flop. The pot stays small, and your big hands do not get paid off the way they should. There is also a psychological cost to always taking the passive route. When you call instead of raise, you are often signaling weakness to your opponents, and they can use that information to push you off hands or value bet thinner against you. It becomes much harder to represent a strong range post-flop if you never take the aggressive line pre-flop. You lose the ability to tell a convincing story, and sharp players will notice. Another trap is that passive play leads to more multi-way pots. When several players limp or call, the pot gets bigger and the decisions get more complicated. Now you are up against 2 or 3 opponents, each with a range that could include almost anything. These are the kinds of situations where cognitive overload creeps in, and the chance of making a mistake on later streets goes way up. Even if you hit the flop, it is rare that you will have the best hand, and you may end up paying off when someone else has a better kicker or a disguised 2-pair. Hands played out of position almost always struggle to realize their full equity. When you play from the blinds or early position and just call, you are forced to act first on every street, which means you have to make tough decisions with incomplete information. Over time, this leads to missed value and losing pots that could have been avoided with a more disciplined pre-flop approach. Reverse implied odds are another hidden danger of passive pre-flop play. When you call with a hand like King Jack offsuit and make top pair, it feels like you have a strong hand. But if your opponent has ace king or king queen, you are in a spot where you can lose a big pot. The worst part is that you often do not see it coming until the chips are already in the middle. These spots add up over hundreds of hours, and the money lost is hard to recover. When you look at the long-term impact, sloppy pre-flop play ends up costing you far more than a single big mistake post-flop. Every time you limp or call too wide, you are putting in money that is likely to end up in someone else's stack. The more players that see the flop, the harder it is to protect your equity, and the more likely it is that you will be forced out of the pot or trapped by a bigger hand. The good news is that these mistakes are not hardwired. You can build habits that protect your stack and set you up for long-term profit. Start by making a plan for every position before you even look at your cards. Know what your default action should be from under the gun, from middle position, from the cutoff, and from the button. If you do not have a strong reason to play a hand from early position, just let it go. Save your aggression and your chips for situations where you have the range and the position to back it up. It helps to track your pre-flop decisions over time. After each session, look back at the hands you chose to play and ask yourself if you would make the same decision again. Patterns will start to emerge, and you will see where you are leaking chips. Sometimes it is not about playing fewer hands, but about playing the right hands at the right time. You want to be in pots because you have a reason to be there, not just because you felt like seeing a flop. There is a simple rule that works well in most cash games. From early and middle positions, either raise or fold. Do not just call unless you are in a spot where calling makes sense from a balanced range, like when you are on the button or in the cutoff with a hand that can play well post-flop. In most player pools and game conditions, calling from out of position with hands like Queen-Jack offsuit or King-10 suited tends to be a losing play over the long run. Remember that you are only going to be dealt a pocket pair about one time out of every 17 deals, which works out to roughly 5.9% of hands. Suited aces, suited connectors, and Broadway hands are the kinds of starting hands that connect with the board and give you options. Weak high-card hands should mostly go in the muck, especially when someone has already shown strength with a raise. If you build your pre-flop habits around discipline and position, you will find that the rest of the hand gets much easier. You will have stronger ranges, you will be the one applying pressure, and you will avoid the cognitive overload that comes from playing too many marginal hands out of position. Every small improvement in your pre-flop routine compounds over time, and the profit you save by folding the bottom of your range will show up in your win rate. Let your decisions slow down a little before the cards are even dealt. Take a breath, look at your position, and remember that every hand you fold is one less spot where you can lose chips for no reason. When you are not forcing yourself into every pot, you will notice how much more deliberate and controlled your session feels. Pre-flop discipline is not about being tight for its own sake. It is about building a foundation that lets your post-flop skills shine when it matters most. Chapter 11. Adjusting for multi-way pots. When you start to feel comfortable avoiding basic pre-flop mistakes, it's easy to think you've solved the hardest part of Texas Hold'em. The truth is, that's only the beginning. Once a hand draws in several callers, you're suddenly dealing with a whole new set of problems. It's not just that more players are in the pot. It's that every one of those extra players changes the value of your cards, the way you read the table, and the kinds of risks you're taking before the flop. When you face several opponents, your hand equity is split among more competitors. Where you might expect to win half the time against a single player, you'll find your share shrinking as the table gets crowded. That means hands that look strong with one opponent can quickly become mediocre or even weak. It's not just about the raw odds either. When more players call pre-flop, the pot balloons, but your ability to push others out with a bet often gets weaker. You're less likely to make everyone fold, and you'll realize your equity less often, especially with hands that need to improve. You'll also see your opponent's ranges getting wider and more tangled. In heads-up pots, you can put your opponent on a fairly narrow selection of hands based on their action. But in a pot with 3 or 4 players, each person's range covers a big chunk of the deck, and the overlap makes it tough to know where you stand. Suddenly that top pair or overpair you loved before the flop starts to feel a lot less comfortable. Another thing that changes fast is stack-to-pot ratio. In multi-way pots, those extra callers make the pot much bigger compared to the effective stacks. This means there's less room to maneuver after the flop. If you make a mistake pre-flop, you might end up stuck in a big pot with a hand that can't handle pressure from several directions. The cost of errors goes up, and the room to recover shrinks. You've probably heard the idea that calling a pre-flop raise with several players behind you caps your range. That's true in a lot of cases. If you only call with medium hands and always raise with your best, observant players notice and start to attack you with squeezes. A well-balanced player will mix in some strong hands as calls, but most players' calling ranges are capped, and that opens the door for aggressive moves from behind. With all of this going on, it's clear that multi-way pots demand a different mindset. The game gets more about discipline and flexibility than about aggression or bluffing. You need to tighten up and pick your spots carefully, because getting involved with the wrong hand at the wrong time can cost you much more than in a heads-up pot. It's not a weakness to play cautiously here. It's a sign you're adjusting to the real risks and complexity of the situation. Now let's talk about how you actually adjust your hand ranges when you expect to play a multi-way pot. This is where you start dividing hands into categories, instead of thinking about them one by one. The main question is which hands go up in value and which go down as more players call. Hands with nut potential become much more valuable. Think about suited connectors or small pocket pairs. Suited connectors like 10-8 suited can flop draws to the nuts, and when they hit, they're often disguised. Pocket pairs can make sets, and in a multi-way pot, you can get paid off by more than one player if you hit. These hands thrive on implied odds, which are the potential to win a big pot when you make a strong hand. On the other hand, hands that only make top pair with a weak kicker, like King-9 offsuit or Queen-Jack offsuit, lose a lot of their shine. In a heads-up pot, top pair might be enough. In a multi-way pot, the chance that someone else has a better pair, 2-pair, or a strong draw goes up. Your hand is more likely to be second best, and you'll often be forced to fold to pressure or lose a big pot when you're outkicked. Position also becomes a much bigger deal in these pots. When you act last, you get to see how everyone else approaches the situation, which gives you a huge advantage. You can control the size of the pot, decide whether to call, raise or fold based on more information, and avoid being trapped by raises behind you. The button, for example, can profitably play a wider range of hands than the small blind, even though the small blind gets a better price on the call, because the button always acts last post-flop and maintains that positional advantage on every street. The small blind, stuck out of position against every other player, has to be much more careful and should generally play tighter. Being in the middle, with players both before and after you, is one of the toughest spots. You're the so-called monkey in the middle, and it's easy to get squeezed or forced to play awkwardly. Even if the pot odds look good, you're not in control of the action, and your decisions can get complicated quickly if the players behind you get aggressive. You might wonder just how often you'll hit those big draws you're chasing. With 2 suited hole cards, you'll flop a flush draw about 1 time in 10, and you'll actually make a flush on the flop less than 1 time in 100. That's not very often, so you need to be selective about which suited hands you play, and always be aware that chasing weak draws can get expensive when the pot is already large. Let's look at some of the strategic ideas that matter most before the flop in these multi-way situations. The first thing that trips up a lot of players is pot odds. When more people call, the pot grows, and it seems like you're getting a great price to call almost anything. But that's a trap. Yes, the pot odds might look appealing, but the problem is that your chances of winning the whole pot go down as more players see the flop. You're more likely to run into a bigger hand, and you're less likely to get your opponents to fold. So you need to be disciplined and avoid calling just because the price looks good. That leads right into the need for tighter value ranges. Against one player, a hand like ace-jack offsuit might be strong enough to play aggressively. In a multi-way pot, you need to raise the bar. The more players in the hand, the stronger your starting hand needs to be to feel confident about its chances at showdown. You want to focus on hands that can make the nuts, or something close to it, not hands that will frequently be second best. Speculative hands can be especially dangerous in these spots. Weak-suited aces or low offsuit connectors might seem tempting because they can make big hands, but the reality is they often get you into trouble. You might flop a pair or a weak draw and feel committed to the pot, only to find out an opponent has the nuts or a better draw. The risk of reverse implied odds, where you hit your hand but still lose a big pot, goes way up when several players are involved. The interaction between pot odds, implied odds, and reverse implied odds gets more complicated with more players. You have to think about how likely it is that you'll be able to realize your equity. That means not just how often your hand will improve, but how often you'll actually win the pot when it does. If you're drawing to a flush and there are several players, the chance that someone else is drawing to a higher flush or already has a bigger made hand goes up, so you need to be cautious. One last idea worth revisiting in this multi-way context is the squeeze play. As covered in Chapter 8, a squeeze involves making a large re-raise over a raise and several callers, exploiting the fact that those callers typically hold capped ranges. The logic is that the original raiser and the callers often have capped ranges, so a big raise can force everyone to fold and scoop up a nice pot. This move works best when you have a solid read on the players involved and enough chips behind to make the pressure meaningful. It's not something to do every time, but in the right spot, it can be a powerful tool. When you do pick up a strong hand in these multi-way pots, you'll often want to size your raises a bit larger than you would heads up. The goal is to extract value from the players who will call you, and to thin the field so you're not trying to beat several hands at once. There's no one-size-fits-all amount, but don't be afraid to go bigger when you want to protect your equity and get heads up or three-way instead of seeing a flop against the whole table. Pot odds by themselves are rarely sufficient to justify a call in these multi-way spots. You need to think about whether your hand can stand up to pressure, whether you can get paid when you hit, and whether you're risking getting trapped with a second-best hand. The best players stay disciplined, building their pre-flop ranges with these realities in mind, and they're willing to let go of hands that look pretty but don't play well against several opponents. When the table gets busy and the pots get big before the flop, you want to slow down your decision-making and keep your standards high. It's not about being passive or afraid. It's about understanding that profit comes from making the right adjustments, playing the right hands, and knowing when to step away from situations that are more trouble than they're worth. Over time, this discipline and flexibility are what set winning players apart in the most complex games. So when you find yourself staring down a pot with 3 or 4 players, take a breath. Tighten up, watch your position, and remember that every chip you save by folding a marginal hand is a chip you can use when the odds are truly in your favor. Let the game slow down and trust that the careful path is the one that wins most often in the long run. Chapter 12. Reading opponents' pre-flop patterns. When you sit down in a cash game and start sorting out your pre-flop decisions, you're probably already thinking about things like position and how your hand stacks up against the ranges you expect from others. That's a solid starting point. But there's another layer you can add that can really separate you from the average player. If you want to make the most of your pre-flop play, you'll want to start noticing how each opponent actually chooses which hands to play and how they enter the pot. Most players have a set of habits when it comes to their pre-flop choices, and if you pay close attention, those habits can tell you a lot about what to expect from them. Over the course of several orbits, you'll start to see patterns. Some players are only putting chips in the pot with strong hands, folding almost everything else. Others seem to play every hand they see, no matter their cards or position. When you watch enough hands, you'll notice that these tendencies fall into 4 broad categories: tight, loose, aggressive, and passive. Tight players are the ones who only get involved with a small selection of hands. They are often waiting for premium holdings and folding most everything else. Loose players, on the other hand, are willing to play a much wider variety of hands. They might limp in or call with weaker holdings, especially from early position, and you'll see them in a lot of pots. Now, aggression is a different axis. Aggressive players like to take the initiative. You'll see them raising and 3-betting more often than most. They're not just calling, they're pushing the action. Passive players, by contrast, are the ones who call more than they raise. They'll limp or flat call pre-flop, and rarely put in a big raise unless they have a very strong hand. It's pretty common to see players who are tight and passive, meaning they only play strong hands and rarely raise, or loose and aggressive, meaning they play a lot of hands and love to raise and re-raise. To really get a grip on what someone's style is, you've got to watch how often they choose to play a hand before the flop, and how often they raise when they do. In poker circles, people sometimes refer to these as VPIP and pre-flop raise frequency, but you don't have to worry about the math right now. What matters is that, over the course of a session, you'll spot who is entering most pots and who is sitting back. You'll also see who likes to come in for a raise and who prefers to just call. Try to avoid making snap judgments from just 1 or 2 hands. The real value comes from seeing these patterns repeat over dozens of hands. Once you've got a mental note of how each player approaches pre-flop, you can start building a working profile for everyone at your table. Once you've got these profiles in your head, you can start tailoring your own play to take advantage of them. When you're up against someone you've pegged as a tight passive player, you want to be careful about calling their raises with marginal hands. The odds are good that they're only putting chips in with premium holdings, so your own range should tighten up. There's usually not much value in trying to run big bluffs against these players either, because they're not likely to fold when they finally do commit to a hand. On the other hand, if you notice someone who's loose and passive, you can open up your own range a bit. These players are in a lot of pots with weak hands, and they're not putting you under much pressure with raises. That means you can raise for value more often, especially with hands that play well against wide ranges. You can also call pre-flop with hands that have good post-flop potential, like suited connectors or suited aces, knowing that you'll often be up against weaker holdings. Aggressive opponents require a different adjustment. If you're facing someone who loves to 3-bet, you'll want to be careful about just calling their raises out of position. It's usually better to either tighten up and only call with hands that can stand up to a lot of pressure, or to 4-bet with a wider range if you think they're overdoing it. When you have position on a loose aggressive player, you can call more often, since being last to act gives you more control over the pot after the flop. If you're out of position though, you'll want to re-raise more often to take the initiative, and avoid having to play big pots passively. It's important to remember that these adjustments are not guesses or hunches. They're responses to things you've actually seen at the table. If you notice an opponent folding to 3-bet much more often than most, maybe they fold closer to 70% rather than a more typical 50 or 60, then you can start 3-betting a little lighter, picking up pots that they're giving up too easily. If you see someone who folds their blinds to steals from late position at a higher rate than average, you can start opening more hands from the button and cutoff, knowing that you'll often pick up the blinds uncontested. Over time, you'll find that these small adjustments add up. The edge you get from exploiting pre-flop patterns is one of the most reliable ways to build a long-term win rate in cash games. Most players don't change their habits much during a session, so if you're paying attention, you'll have a pretty good sense of what to expect each time the action comes around. Against a tight player, you can steal their blinds more aggressively and fold when they show strength. Against a loose player, you can value bet thinner and play more speculative hands that can win big pots when you hit. There's no need to bluff as much, since they're not folding anyway. The real magic comes from doing this over and over, hand after hand. Each time you make a small adjustment based on what you've seen, you're increasing your edge. It might not feel like much in a single hand, but over hundreds or thousands of hands, these edges compound. That's how profitable players pull ahead of the break-even crowd. They're not just relying on their own cards or basic strategy. They're constantly updating their reads and making new decisions as opponents reveal more about their play style. It's also worth remembering that these reads aren't set in stone. Players can adjust, and sometimes they'll notice you adjusting to them. That's why it pays to keep watching and updating your mental profiles as the session goes on. If someone who started out loose and passive suddenly tightens up or starts raising more, you'll want to pick up on that quickly. The more you notice, the more you can adapt. You don't need to rush. Take your time, watch the hands unfold, and let the patterns reveal themselves. The table will give you all the information you need if you're patient. With a quiet focus, you'll start to see the game in a new way, not just as a set of cards and positions, but as a living, breathing contest of tendencies and adjustments. That's where the real edge lies, and it's always there for those who are willing to pay attention. Let the rhythm of the table settle in, and you'll find your place in the flow of the game, hand after hand. Chapter 13. Balancing Aggression and Passivity. Preflop. There is a point in most players' development where reading the table feels natural, but the question of how to manage your own frequencies before the flop stays stubbornly unsettled. Once you can read those patterns, the next step is turning that lens inward. It becomes about managing how you're seen at the table, and that starts with how you balance aggression and passivity before the flop. Every pre-flop decision you make, whether you raise, call, or fold, paints a picture for your opponents. If that picture is easy to read, you'll find yourself up against players who know how to take advantage. Balancing your approach pre-flop is not about finding a single perfect mix and sticking to it. Strong players tend to shift their frequencies over the course of a session, sometimes raising more, sometimes calling more, but consistently trying to prevent opponents from settling into a comfortable read on their range. If you push the aggressive side too far, you'll end up with a pre-flop raise frequency that matches almost every hand you choose to play. This can work for a while, especially against opponents who are too passive to fight back. But over time, sharp players will notice that you're in there with a wide range and start 3-betting you light or calling with hands that play well against your weaker holdings. That's when pots get big with hands that do not want to play for stacks, and suddenly aggression becomes its own trap. On the other end, if you're too passive, you'll see a big gap between the hands you play and the hands you raise. You'll find yourself calling a lot pre-flop, letting others dictate the pace, and missing out on value when you do have strong hands. Over many sessions, that means leaving chips on the table, and you'll also start to lose the initiative. Opponents will get to see cheap flops against you, and you'll be the one reacting rather than setting the terms. The sweet spot is usually somewhere in between. In most cash games, a balanced approach means your pre-flop raise frequency is a little lower than your voluntarily put money in pot percentage, but not by a huge margin. That small gap tells the table you're mostly raising when you enter the pot, with a handful of calls mixed in for balance. It is not a fixed number, but if you're playing something like a full ring game, you'll often see strong players with a voluntarily put money in pot percentage between 15 and 25%, and a pre-flop raise percentage just a few points below that. In six-handed games, ranges typically open up, and cut-off opening ranges in many solver-informed strategies cover somewhere in the range of 1/4 to 1/3 of all hands, though this varies with stack depth, opponent tendencies, and the specific game environment. Finding your balance is not a one-time calculation. Every table has its own flow, and the way people are playing will shift hour by hour. If you're at a table where most players are just calling along and not fighting for pots, you'll want to lean into more aggression. That means opening more hands, especially in late position, and keeping the pressure on those who fold too much. Players who call too wide and rarely fight back are giving you an opening to pick up pots uncontested, and the initiative is yours as long as you keep them guessing. Things change when the table gets more aggressive. If you're getting 3-bet often, or you see frequent squeezes from the blinds, it may be time to tighten up. That does not mean shutting down completely, but it does mean being more selective with which hands you open and which hands you call with. Against players who only raise 5 to 10% of hands, you know they are showing up with big pairs and strong Broadway cards, so calling with marginal hands just to see a flop is a losing proposition. On the other hand, if someone is 3-betting you with all sorts of hands, you can respond by either tightening your opens or widening your own 3-bet range to put them to the test. Stack depth shapes how far you lean in either direction. As covered earlier, deep stacks invite more speculative opens, because the implied odds justify it, while short stacks compress your options toward a raise or fold approach. What matters here is how that stack context interacts with your aggression balance. A wide opening range makes more sense when you are deep enough to realize the value of those hands post-flop. You'll also want to watch for situations where there are several callers ahead of you. The more people in the pot, the more likely someone has a strong hand, so squeezing with a wide range becomes riskier. Many experienced players choose to squeeze with hands that play well if called, or simply tighten up and wait for a better spot. All of these adjustments come from reading the table and knowing your opponents. Some tables reward relentless pressure, while others punish it. The key is not guessing, but responding based on patterns you have already picked up. If you see someone folding too often to raises, there is no reason not to keep attacking their blinds. If someone always defends, you may need to hold back and wait for a stronger hand before committing chips. How you balance aggression and passivity does not just affect your own results, it changes how the whole table sees you. In any cash game, everyone is watching for patterns, and the moment you become predictable, someone will start to adjust. If you only raise with strong hands, you'll get little action when you finally pick up a big one. If you are always raising, opponents will start to play back at you, and you'll find yourself in tough spots with weak holdings. Keeping your opponents guessing is one of the most valuable skills you can develop. When nobody can pin down whether your raise means aces, a suited connector, or a well-timed bluff, they are forced to make decisions with less information. They may call too light, fold hands that could have won, or make expensive mistakes. All of that adds up to profit for you, and it makes your post-flop game easier as well, since your opponents cannot narrow your range as easily. A balanced pre-flop approach is not just about being hard to read. It is a tool you use to shape the way the table responds to you. If you have built a reputation for being unpredictable, you can get away with more bluffs or value bets, because nobody is quite sure what you might have. Over time, this reputation becomes part of your edge, and it lets you control the flow of the game in ways that predictable players cannot. Finding that balance is an ongoing process. You'll adjust as the table changes, as stacks get deeper or shorter, and as you spot new patterns. The more adaptable you become, the harder it will be for anyone to find a simple answer for how to play against you. That is what keeps you a step ahead, hand after hand, session after session. Letting your game breathe and shift with the table is not just good strategy. Over time, it is the difference between grinding out results and consistently getting the better of the table. Take a moment to notice the rhythm of the table, the pace of the action, and how your own presence fits into it. The more conscious you are of that balance, the more you can influence what happens next. Every hand is a new chance to test and refine that balance, making you a little less predictable and a little more dangerous every time the cards come around. Chapter 14: Advanced Range Analysis Techniques. You've probably noticed by now that the way you balance aggression and passivity before the flop shapes how other players see you. Once you've got that down, the next step is learning to be more analytical about the hands your opponents might actually have. This is where range analysis moves beyond just tight or loose and becomes a real tool you can use to make better decisions before the flop. Many players at the table are making rough guesses about what their opponents might hold, but advanced range analysis is about building a systematic process. Think of it as constructing a map of all the hands someone could have based on what you know about them, their position, and how they play. Instead of trying to put someone on a single hand, you're looking for patterns in how they act, and using those to build a whole set of possibilities. These possibilities form what we call a range. Now, ranges are not all built the same way. Sometimes a player's range is balanced, meaning they mix strong hands with some bluffs. That makes it harder for you to pick apart what they have, because their actions stay unpredictable. Other times you'll see a polarized range, which is mostly the very best hands, and some weak bluffs but not much in between. It's like they're at the extremes, either holding monsters or nothing, skipping over the middle. There are also linear ranges, which just run down the list from the strongest hands, including everything in order until they stop. These are most common when a player is opening from early position and just playing the top of the deck. Condensed ranges, on the other hand, are mostly medium-strength hands, and you'll spot these when someone is calling a raise rather than making one. Merged ranges blend strong hands with some medium ones, making it harder to know if you're up against value or a disguised bluff. What you'll find is that the best range for a spot depends on the position, the way the table is playing, and what you know about your opponents. Every time a player checks, bets, raises, or calls, they're giving you new information. When you're paying close attention, you can start to rule out hands they probably do not have. This is what we mean by deconstructing a range. Suppose someone raises from early position, and then 3 bets when you re-raise them. Already you can take out the weakest hands from their possible range, since most players only take that line with strong hands. If they just call instead, maybe they're holding something more in the middle, like those condensed ranges we talked about. By watching how someone acts and how often they take certain lines, you start knocking out options, narrowing down the list of what they could be holding. Position is one of the most important clues you'll get. Players in early position usually play tighter, sticking to strong hands, while those in late position tend to open up and include more speculative or weaker holdings. Bet sizing is another big tell. A small raise might signal a wider range, while a big 3-bet usually means strength, though that can change if you're up against a tricky or aggressive player. When you see someone who only ever calls with certain hands or always raises with others, it becomes easier to build a more precise range for them. Game dynamics influence ranges too. If the whole table is playing aggressively, people might tighten up and only play their best hands. If everyone is playing passively, you'll often see wider ranges as players try to pick off easy pots. Stack depth matters as well. Deep stacks let people speculate more, while shallow stacks force tighter, more value-driven play. Every one of these factors helps you build, adjust, and refine the map of hands you think your opponent could be holding. The key is that this is not a one-time process. Every hand, every action, every session, you're gathering new evidence and adjusting your assumptions. Advanced range analysis is about staying disciplined, using every piece of information to keep your picture of an opponent's range as accurate as possible. It is a process of elimination and ongoing adjustment, not just a single educated guess. Now let's talk about how you can make this process more concrete and less abstract. There are a lot of tools out there that can help you practice building and refining ranges when you're away from the table. These are not just for pros or math wizards. They're designed to turn the fuzzy idea of a range into something you can see and work with. Range visualization tools are probably the most common. They give you a grid that shows every possible 2-card starting hand, and you can shade in which hands you'd play in a spot, then assign how often you'd take certain actions with each one. This makes it easier to see where your range is strong, where it's weak, and how balanced it is. You can adjust these grids for different positions or opponents, and review your choices later to spot leaks in your strategy. Equity calculators are another powerful tool. These let you pit one range against another and see how they stack up over thousands of simulated hands. For example, if you want to know how your opening range from the cutoff performs against a typical big blind defending range, you can set it up and get a percentage for how often you'd expect to come out ahead. You can even get granular and look at how different draws perform. With an open-ended straight draw, for example, you have about a 17% chance to hit it on the next card. If you're drawing to a gut shot, it's closer to 8.5%. These numbers help you understand which hands are worth continuing with and which should be folded. The main benefit of using these tools is that they help you internalize what good range construction looks like. The more you practice mapping out ranges and testing them against different opponents, the more natural it feels when you're actually playing. You'll start to recognize patterns faster and make better adjustments on the fly. The tools are not there to make decisions for you in real time, but they give you a framework to fall back on, especially in tricky spots where your instincts might lead you astray. Consistency is what matters most. The more often you sit down and work through ranges, the more you'll start to see connections between what happens away from the table and what you're seeing in live play. Over time, you'll start to spot the same mistakes or tendencies in your opponents and know exactly how to adjust your own play to exploit them. Once you've started to see ranges as living, changing things, the next step is to apply that thinking in real time. Making dynamic adjustments to your range is what separates solid, predictable players from those who can really take advantage of the game as it unfolds. Every session, you're collecting information about how your opponents play, and you can use that to fine-tune your own decisions. Let's say you're playing a cash game, and you notice a player on your right who only 3-bets with the very strongest hands. You can respond by tightening up your opening range when they're behind you, since you're more likely to face a re-raise and have to play a big pot out of position. On the other hand, if someone in the blinds is defending way too wide and calling with almost anything, you can open up and include more speculative hands in your own range, knowing you'll often have the best of it after the flop. Patterns in how often someone 3-bets, flat calls or folds from certain positions are some of the best clues you'll get. If you see a player who 3-bets a lot from late position, but almost never from early, you can adjust your strategy and give their late position re-raises less respect. If another player always calls but never raises, you can start value betting thinner, knowing they rarely have the top of their range. These adjustments are never final. As the session goes on, you'll keep picking up more data. Maybe someone who looked tight at first starts loosening up, or a passive player suddenly starts making big moves. The more hands you see, the more refined your range estimates become. This is why the value of dynamic range adjustment tends to increase as a session goes on and you get a clearer picture of who you're up against. Of course, things can change. New players might join the table, or someone might get tired and start making mistakes, so you always need to stay alert and ready to recalibrate. Other factors come into play as well. Table aggression is a big one. If the whole table is playing wild, you might want to tighten up and wait for premium spots. If everyone's playing scared, you can take over and widen your range, picking up pots uncontested. Stack depth also matters. With deep stacks, you can afford to speculate more, knowing you have room to maneuver after the flop. When stacks get shorter, you want to focus on hands that play well all in, avoiding marginal spots that can put your stack at risk. As you get more comfortable with these adjustments, you'll start to see how every small edge compounds over time. The more accurately you can map out an opponent's likely holdings and adjust your own range in response, the more profit you'll find in spots where others are just guessing. It is a skill that pays off the longer you play and the more information you have to work with. None of this comes overnight. It takes methodical practice and deliberate review. Every session is a chance to gather more data, test your assumptions, and see how your adjustments play out. The more disciplined you are about reviewing your ranges away from the table and making conscious adjustments during play, the more naturally advanced range analysis will become part of your game. This kind of thinking is really the next evolution in how you approach poker. Instead of relying on gut feelings or trying to outguess your opponents one hand at a time, you're building a process that lets you adapt to any lineup, any table, and any opponent. Over time, you'll find that the process itself becomes familiar. The noise of the table fades a bit, and you start to see the structure underneath. That's when you know you're making the game work for you, not just reacting to what happens. For most players who put in the work, these advanced techniques gradually feel less like a conscious effort and more like an ingrained habit. Let yourself settle into that mindset and let the patterns come to you. Chapter 15: Integrating Preflop Decisions into Overall Strategy. By now, the decisions you make before a single community card hits the felt have shaped every hand you have played through this series. Advanced range analysis, hand selection, positional awareness, stack depth, opponent reads, all of it has been pointing toward one idea: preflop choices are not isolated events. They are the architecture of every hand that follows. Everything you have picked up about how to select hands, size bets, and adapt to your opponents comes together here. All that knowledge is not just a set of tools you use before the flop and then forget. It forms the entire framework that supports your play in every hand, from the very first card to the last river bet. When you sit down at a cash game table, every decision you make before the flop gives shape to the rest of the hand. You are not just picking cards to play. You are deciding which opponents you want to tangle with, how deep the stacks will be, and what kind of situations you will face when the community cards come. Letting the wrong hands slip into your pre-flop range can make every street after the flop much tougher than it needs to be. Suddenly, you find yourself guessing with weak holdings, scrambling to make up for a mistake that could have been avoided by folding or raising more selectively. Imagine you are holding a hand that barely scrapes into your range from early position. Maybe you are tempted to call because the table seems passive, or you just want to see a flop. When you do that, you are often setting yourself up for trouble. If you miss the flop, you are left with a weak hand and a tough spot. If you hit a marginal draw or a second pair, you might end up calling down bets with little chance to win. Every time you enter a pot with a hand that does not really fit your range for the situation, you are building a house on shaky ground. Over time, those cracks show up in your results. On the other hand, when you are disciplined about which hands you play and how you play them, you are building a solid foundation. You are entering pots with hands that have enough equity to stand up to pressure. You are putting yourself in position to represent strong hands later, because your pre-flop choices constrain what you can credibly show down. The ranges you build before the flop set the boundaries for what you can do on later streets. If you only raise with strong hands in a certain spot, your opponents have to respect your bets later on. If you call or raise too loosely, they will catch on and start exploiting you. Position is a huge part of this equation. When you are acting last, you can play a wider range of hands because you get to see what everyone else does first. When you are out of position, you need to tighten up and stick to hands that can handle the pressure. Stack depth matters just as much. With deeper stacks, you can play more speculative hands because the potential reward is higher. When stacks are short, you want to focus on hands that can make strong pairs or better, since there is not as much room to maneuver after the flop. Your opponents are always part of the equation too. Some players fold too much before the flop, so you can raise them often with a wide range. Others call too much or play back too aggressively, which means you need to tighten up and stick to hands that can stand the heat. There are 1,326 possible starting hand combinations when suits are treated as distinct in Texas Hold'em, though these reduce to 169 strategically unique hand types when suits are grouped by relative rank, but you will only play a fraction of them in most spots, and which ones you choose depends on all these factors. Folding before the flop is not just giving up on the hand. It is a conscious decision to avoid a bad situation and keep your stack intact. Calling keeps you in the hand, but it commits chips and limits your options if things get tricky later. Raising puts the pressure on your opponents, builds the pot when you have an edge, and shapes who sticks around for the flop. Each choice has consequences that ripple through the rest of the hand, so thinking carefully about your pre-flop decisions is never wasted effort. Over the long run, sticking to disciplined pre-flop habits tends to pay off in ways you can measure. When you only enter pots with hands that fit your plan, you reduce the number of tough, marginal spots you face later. That means you are less likely to get caught making expensive mistakes. Loose pre-flop habits tend to create more variance. You can end up in more pots with hands that are hard to play, which often means facing tough decisions for big pots with weak holdings. Over time, that pattern can lead to bigger swings and added frustration. Playing tight before the flop does not just mean playing fewer hands. It means playing the right hands for the right reasons, with a plan for how you will proceed on later streets. When you consistently enter pots with a range advantage, you will generally find yourself in more situations where you can apply pressure and extract value. Your bets on the flop, turn, and river become easier to size because your range is stronger and more predictable. You do not have to bluff as often to win pots, because your opponents are the ones with weaker hands more often. That confidence comes from knowing your pre-flop decisions set you up for success. Think about the way stack depths and the stack-to-pot ratio affect your choices. If you know how much money is left behind after the flop, you can plan your betting lines with much more precision. You will know when it makes sense to commit your stack, when to slow down, and when to apply maximum pressure. All of that starts with the sizes you choose before the flop, and the types of hands you select to play. Evaluating the expected value of each pre-flop option, folding, calling, or raising, is not just an academic exercise. Every time you choose the highest expected value action, you are nudging your long-term win rate a little higher. Over thousands of hands, those small edges add up. You do not have to be perfect every time, but you do have to be thoughtful and consistent. That is how disciplined pre-flop play turns into real money in your pocket over time. As you keep playing, you will notice that the games themselves do not stay the same. What works at one table or in one player pool may not work as well somewhere else. Maybe the players start calling more often, or maybe they tighten up and make it harder to steal blinds. Maybe the aggression ramps up, and you have to adjust your ranges to avoid getting caught in big pots with weak hands. The only way to stay ahead is to keep reviewing your pre-flop decisions, tracking your results, and staying open to new ideas. When you go back over your hands after a session, look for patterns. Are you losing money from early position with certain hands? Are you getting 3-bet too often when you open from late position? Are there spots where you feel lost after the flop because your pre-flop hand selection put you in a bind? These are the clues that tell you where your strategy needs work. By taking the time to reflect and adjust, you turn every session into a learning opportunity. The players who keep getting better are the ones who treat pre-flop skill